With all due respect, Congresswoman Crockett, Senator Lisa Murkowski said with a dismissive wave of her hand, "Your brief political career hardly qualifies you to lecture us about long-term infrastructure planning. Some of us have been working on these issues since before you passed the bar exam." The Senate committee room fell silent. All eyes turned to Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the freshman representative invited to testify about infrastructure impacts on underserved communities. For 2 seconds, Crockett sat perfectly still, her expression unchanged. Then she leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Senator Murkowski," she replied, her voice measured but clear. "My brief political career followed years representing communities that lived with the consequences of the exact planning decisions this committee has made. Perhaps that's precisely the perspective you've been missing." The gallery erupted in murmurs as Mausk's expression shifted from dismissive to surprised. What happened next wasn't just a defense of credentials. It was a masterclass in turning dismissal into opportunity that completely transformed the hearing's power dynamic. Before we reveal exactly what Congresswoman Crockett said that caused 3 committee members to put down their phones and caused Senator Murkowski herself to completely change her approach, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. This moment contains a powerful lesson about turning underestimation into advantage that applies far beyond politics. Have you ever been dismissed or underestimated because you were new to a role or position? How did you respond to having your experience questioned? Share your story in the comments below. The Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works hearing wasn't supposed to make headlines. Titled Infrastructure Investment Planning for the Next Decade, it was the kind of substantive but typically low-profile session that shapes policy without attracting significant public attention. Senator Lisa Murkowski, the senior Republican from Alaska, had built her reputation on these kinds of hearings. With 21 years in the Senate, Murkowski had established herself as a moderate Republican, known for occasional bipartisanship and deep knowledge of energy and infrastructure issues. Her questioning of witnesses was typically thorough and substantive, if sometimes pointed. "Senator Murkowski approaches these hearings like the lawyer she is," explained congressional analyst Robert Chan. "She's detailed, methodical, and generally more interested in policy specifics than scoring political points. That makes her occasional sharp moments stand out even more." Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th District, was still in her first term in Congress. A former civil rights attorney, Crockett had quickly established herself as an effective communicator who didn't shy away from confrontation when principles were at stake. Her legal background and experience representing underserved communities informed her approach to policy, particularly around infrastructure and environmental justice. What makes Crockett effective is her ability to connect abstract policy to concrete community impacts, noted political analyst Maria Rodriguez. She brings her experience as an attorney for communities affected by infrastructure decisions into her role as a legislator in a way that's both passionate and precise. The hearing's witness list included the usual mix of federal officials, industry representatives, and academic experts. Crockett's invitation to testify had come from the Democratic chair, who wanted perspective on how infrastructure decisions affected urban and minority communities. Voices historically underrepresented in such planning discussions. The topic scheduled for discussion was substantive, if technical. Funding formulas for highway maintenance, prioritization criteria for water system upgrades, climate resilience requirements for new projects, and coordination between federal, state, and local authorities. Important issues that affected millions of Americans, but typically discussed in technical language that obscured their human impact. What no one anticipated was how a single dismissive comment would transform a routine hearing into a powerful moment that would be studied in political communication classes for years to come. The hearing began with standard opening statements from committee members and the first panel of witnesses. Crockett's testimony came during the second panel focusing on communities often overlooked in infrastructure planning. "Thank you for the opportunity to address this committee." She began while we discuss funding formulas and regulatory frameworks. "I'd like to ensure we remember the communities where these decisions have their most direct impact. In my district and others like it across the country, infrastructure isn't an abstraction. It's about whether the water is safe to drink, whether public transportation is available to reach jobs, and whether flooding protection exists for vulnerable neighborhoods. She continued with specific examples and data. Neighborhoods where inadequate public transportation meant 3-hour daily commutes. Communities where deteriorating water systems delivered contaminated water to schools. Areas where insufficient flood protection left residents facing repeated disaster recovery. She connected these examples to specific gaps in the current infrastructure planning process and proposed concrete reforms to address them. Her testimony was substantive and specific, grounded in both data and direct experience. As she concluded, several committee members were taking notes, apparently engaged with her perspective. Then came time for questions from the committee members. Senator James Richardson from Ohio asked about coordination between federal and local authorities. Senator Martinez from New Mexico inquired about climate resilience standards. Both exchanges were substantive and respectful. When Senator Murkowski's turn came, the tone shifted dramatically. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, "you've painted quite a picture of infrastructure challenges. But I'm concerned that your testimony seems to suggest that these issues haven't been priorities for this committee." She shuffled through some papers. "I've been working on water infrastructure funding since 2005, long before you entered Congress." Crockett began to respond. "Senator, I didn't mean to suggest," Murkowski continued, "and you've proposed significant changes to funding formulas that have been refined through decades of careful balancing between competing priorities and jurisdictions." Again, Crockett tried to clarify. "The adjustments I'm suggesting are based on demonstrated need." That's when Murkowski delivered the dismissal that would change the entire dynamic of the hearing. "With all due respect, Congresswoman Crockett, your brief political career hardly qualifies you to lecture us about long-term infrastructure planning. Some of us have been working on these issues since before you passed the bar exam." The comment hung in the air, a classic attempt to dismiss a younger colleague based on tenure rather than substance. It was the kind of remark that had silenced many newcomers in the halls of Congress before. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't easily silenced. "Have you noticed how experience is sometimes used as a shield against new perspectives? Why do you think tenure in a position is often valued over direct experience with the issues being discussed? Share your thoughts in the comments." The committee room fell silent after Senator Murkowski's dismissive comment. Chairman Davis looked uncomfortable, clearly wondering whether to intervene. Junior members of the committee glanced at each other, recognizing the familiar dynamic of a senior member pulling rank on a newer voice. For 2 seconds, Congresswoman Crockett sat perfectly still, her expression unchanged. Those who knew her recognized this as a moment of decision, not about whether to respond, but about how to do so effectively. Then she leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Senator Murkowski," she replied, her voice measured but clear. "My brief political career followed years representing communities that lived with the consequences of the exact planning decisions this committee has made. Perhaps that's precisely the perspective you've been missing." The gallery erupted in murmurs as Murkowski's expression shifted from dismissive to surprised. Crockett continued before the senator could respond. "With respect to your tenure on this committee, Senator," she said, maintaining direct eye contact, "I don't question your experience or dedication, but experience in making policy isn't the same as experience living under that policy. The communities I represented as an attorney and now represent in Congress have decades of experience with the real-world outcomes of infrastructure decisions made in rooms just like this one." Crockett didn't raise her voice or show anger, but her words carried unmistakable force. "When I talk about water systems that deliver lead-contaminated water to elementary schools, I'm not speaking theoretically. I've represented those schools. When I discuss inadequate flood protection, I've stood with families as they gutted their homes after repeated flooding that proper infrastructure could have prevented." She paused briefly, then continued with precision that reflected her courtroom background. "The funding formulas I'm suggesting adjustments to, the ones you described as carefully balanced, have resulted in 73% less infrastructure investment in minority communities compared to other areas with similar population density and tax base. That's not my opinion, Senator. That's data from the Congressional Research Service, your own research division." The room remained silent as Crockett shifted from defense to a broader point. I haven't come to lecture anyone on their years of service. I've come to ensure that the lived experience of overlooked communities informs your next decades of infrastructure planning. If that perspective seems challenging to the conventional wisdom in this committee, perhaps that's exactly why it needs to be heard. For a moment, Senator Murkowski seemed unsure how to respond. The typical dynamics of such exchanges where the senior member's dismissal effectively marginalized the junior voice had been completely appended. Crockett had neither backed down nor escalated into personal attack. Instead, she had reframed the entire discussion around the substantive gap in perspective that her presence was meant to address. Chairman Davis, recognizing the significance of the moment, intervened. "Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett. Senator Murkowski, did you have additional questions?" Murkowski gathered herself. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman." She shuffled her papers, visibly recalibrating her approach. "Congresswoman, you mentioned data showing disparities in infrastructure investment. Could you elaborate on your methodology for measuring that gap?" The question was substantive, a notable shift from the previous dismissal. Crockett responded with equal substance, outlining the research methods, data sources, and comparative analysis that supported her claims about investment disparities. She cited specific projects, funding allocations, and outcome measurements that demonstrated the pattern. "The methodology wasn't mine alone, Senator," she noted. "It built on work from urban planning researchers at MIT, the Brookings Institution, and the Infrastructure Equity Initiative. What my team contributed was connecting these broad patterns to specific funding decision points where different prioritization criteria could have produced more equitable outcomes." As Crockett spoke, several committee members who had been only half attending suddenly engaged more fully. Senator Richardson began taking notes. Senator Martinez leaned forward slightly. The technical discussion had been transformed into something more compelling by the human stakes Crockett had placed at its center. Murkowski listened attentively, then asked a follow-up question that surprised many observers. "Given these disparities you've identified, what specific changes to our funding formulas would you prioritize if you were sitting on this committee?" This question, treating Crockett as a colleague whose expertise was valued rather than a junior member to be dismissed, represented a remarkable shift in dynamic. More importantly, it opened space for the substantive discussion that the hearing was meant to facilitate. Crockett responded with specific recommendations. Adjustments to population density calculations that currently disadvantaged certain communities. Transparency requirements for equity impact assessments. Participatory planning mandates to ensure affected communities had meaningful input, and accountability metrics tied to actual outcomes rather than just dollars spent. Her recommendations were detailed and pragmatic, reflecting both her legal background and her direct experience with affected communities. As she spoke, Murkowski nodded occasionally, engaging with the substance rather than the status differential that had dominated their earlier exchange. When Crockett finished, Murkowski responded with unexpected candor. "Those are thoughtful suggestions, Congresswoman, particularly the accountability metrics. We've struggled with meaningful outcome measurement for years." She paused briefly. "I appreciate you directing us back to the substantive issues. Sometimes those of us who have been here a while can focus too much on process and not enough on impacts." This acknowledgement, subtle but clear, transformed the atmosphere in the hearing room. What had begun as a tense confrontation across lines of seniority, party, and background had evolved into a substantive exchange about real issues affecting millions of Americans. For the remaining hour of the hearing, the discussion maintained this substantive focus. Other committee members engaged with Crockett's testimony and recommendations, asking detailed questions and occasionally challenging specific points. But the dismissiveness that had characterized Murkowski's initial approach was notably absent. Most significantly, the content of the discussion shifted. Where earlier questions had focused primarily on technical aspects of funding mechanisms and jurisdictional authorities, the conversation now regularly returned to equity impacts and community outcomes. Crockett's reframing had not just defended her own credentials, but had effectively redirected the entire committee's focus toward the human consequences of their technical decisions. As the hearing concluded, Chairman Davis thanked the witnesses for their testimony. "This has been one of our more illuminating sessions," he noted. "I particularly appreciate the range of perspectives represented, and the substantive exchange of ideas. The comment, while diplomatic, acknowledged the unusual nature of what had transpired. Media analysts later noted how Crockett's response to Murkowski's dismissal had exemplified effective communication in hierarchical settings. What made Crockett's approach remarkable wasn't just standing her ground, explained Dr. Jennifer Liu, an expert in political communication. It was how she transformed what could have been a merely personal exchange about credentials into a substantive discussion about representation and perspective. She didn't just defend herself. She illuminated the very gap in understanding that made her presence valuable. Have you ever had to redirect a conversation from personal dismissal back to substantive issues? What techniques helped you maintain focus on the larger purpose rather than just defending yourself? Share your approaches in the comments. As committee members and witnesses gathered their materials after the hearing adjourned, something unexpected happened. Senator Murkowski approached Congresswoman Crockett at the witness table. The conversation that followed wasn't captured on the official video feed, but several observers later described it. Murkowski spoke briefly with Crockett, their exchange appearing cordial and engaged. At one point, Murkowski handed Crockett a business card. They shook hands before departing, a small gesture that nonetheless signaled a shift from their early attention. What transpired in that brief exchange became clear 3 days later when Murkowski's office issued a press release announcing a new infrastructure equity working group that would specifically examine disparities in infrastructure investment and outcomes. More surprisingly, the release noted that the working group would include bipartisan representatives from both chambers, including Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, whose testimony highlighted significant gaps in our current approach. This development, a senior senator not only acknowledging the substance of Crockett's critique, but actively creating space to address it, represented an unusual outcome from such a confrontational beginning. Political observers noted its significance. What we witnessed wasn't just conflict resolution, commented political analyst James Wilson. It was a senior legislator recognizing that her initial dismissal had been misplaced and taking concrete action to incorporate the perspective she had initially rejected. That's remarkably rare in today's political environment. Behind the scenes, the process had been more complex than the public narrative suggested. According to staffers who spoke on background, Murkowski had approached Crockett after the hearing with a straightforward acknowledgement. "You made some points today that we need to address more seriously. I'd like to continue that conversation." Crockett, recognizing the significance of this overture from a senior member of the opposite party, had responded with equal directness. "I'd welcome that, Senator. The communities I'm concerned about don't benefit from partisan standoffs." This exchange, brief but substantive, laid the groundwork for staff-level discussions that quickly evolved into the working group announcement. Murkowski's legislative director and Crockett's chief of staff began identifying specific areas where their bosses' interests aligned despite their different political perspectives and constituencies. What connected them was a shared frustration with systems that weren't delivering as promised, explained a senior committee staffer. Murkowski has spent years trying to improve infrastructure outcomes and was genuinely interested in understanding why certain communities weren't benefiting from programs she had helped design. Once she got past the initial territorial response, she recognized that Crockett's perspective could help address that gap. For Crockett, the working group represented an opportunity to translate critique into concrete policy improvements. The Congresswoman didn't come to Washington just to point out problems. Her communications director noted in a statement, "She came to fix them. Working across chambers and across the aisle is essential to delivering real results for overlooked communities." The media coverage of this development focused heavily on the dramatic reversal from Murkowski's initial dismissal to active collaboration. Political talk shows played clips of the tense exchange, followed by images of the working group announcement, creating a compelling narrative of conflict transformed into productive engagement. "This is how Congress is supposed to work," commented Senator Richardson, who had witnessed the exchange firsthand. Legitimate tensions and different perspectives exist, but the goal should be turning those tensions into better policy, not just scoring points. Both Senator Murkowski and Congresswoman Crockett ultimately prioritized problem-solving over pride. Within policy circles, the substance of the working group generated significant interest. Infrastructure equity had been discussed in academic and advocacy contexts for years, but rarely received focused attention from lawmakers with the seniority to effect change. Murkowski's involvement in particular signaled that the issue might gain traction beyond traditional partisan lines. Senator Murkowski has credibility with colleagues who might otherwise dismiss these concerns as identity politics, explained Dr. Elena Martinez, an infrastructure policy expert. By acknowledging the validity of Crockett's critique and creating institutional space to address it, she's potentially opening the door to reforms that might otherwise never get serious consideration. For communities affected by infrastructure disparities, this development represented a rare moment where their concerns might actually translate into policy change. Community advocates who had spent years documenting these issues suddenly found allies in unexpected places. "We've been talking about infrastructure inequality for decades," said Robert Chen, director of the Urban Infrastructure Alliance. To see a senior Republican senator not only acknowledge these disparities, but actively work to address them, that's the kind of breakthrough we've been waiting for. The working group's first meeting, held 2 weeks after the hearing, demonstrated that the collaboration was more than a public relations exercise. Both Murkowski and Crockett arrived with substantive proposals and detailed questions. The discussion focused on specific reforms to funding formulas, data collection methods to better track disparities, and accountability mechanisms to ensure improved outcomes. Most significantly, both brought relevant colleagues into the conversation. Murkowski had recruited 2 fellow Republicans interested in infrastructure efficiency and fiscal accountability. Crockett had engaged Democratic representatives with similar communities in their districts. This expansion beyond the original pair signaled potential for broader impact. What began as a tense exchange between 2 individuals has evolved into something with real legislative potential, noted congressional observer Maria Rodriguez. That's the best possible outcome from conflict in a legislative body. Transformation of tension into productive problem-solving. The media narrative around both women evolved as well. Initial coverage had framed their exchange in predictable terms. The established senator putting a newcomer in her place, followed by the newcomer's clap back. But as the substantive collaboration became clear, more thoughtful analysis emerged. "What we witnessed wasn't just political theater," wrote columnist Rebecca Martinez. "It was a masterclass in turning dismissal into opportunity." Crockett didn't just defend her credentials. She demonstrated why her perspective was essential to the committee's work. And Murkowski showed something equally important: the capacity to recognize when initial judgment has been misplaced and to adjust course accordingly. This framing, focusing on the substantive outcome rather than just the conflict, offered a different model for understanding political exchange rather than the usual zero-sum narrative where one side wins and another losses. This story suggested the possibility of conflict as a pathway to more complete understanding and better policy for younger lawmakers and those from underrepresented backgrounds. Crockett's approach offered a valuable template for responding to dismissal without either backing down or escalating unproductively. By maintaining focus on the substantive issues while clearly establishing her unique value, she had created opening for collaboration rather than merely winning the exchange. The key was that she never made it primarily about herself, observed Dr. Jennifer Liu. Even when directly dismissed, she immediately redirected to the communities she represented and the substantive gaps in perspective. That approach is much harder to dismiss than just defending personal credentials. Have you seen conflicts transform into collaboration in your professional experience? What factors make it possible for people to move past initial tension into productive problem-solving? Share your observations in the comments. The Infrastructure Equity Working Group might have remained simply an interesting political anecdote, a momentary collaboration born from conflict before returning to business as usual. Instead, it produced substantive outcomes that influenced infrastructure policy across multiple federal agencies and spending programs. 6 months after its formation, the working group released a comprehensive report documenting disparities in infrastructure investment and outcomes across different communities. The report included detailed analysis of funding formulas, decision-making processes, and measurement metrics that had contributed to these disparities, often inadvertently. More importantly, it offered specific actionable recommendations, revisions to population density calculations that had disadvantaged certain communities, transparency requirements for equity impact assessments, community participation mandates for major projects, and outcome-based accountability metrics to replace simple spending measures. The report's release received bipartisan support, a rarity in the polarized political environment. Senator Murkowski and Congresswoman Crockett held a joint press conference presenting the findings and recommendations, each emphasizing different aspects that aligned with their political perspectives, but arriving at shared conclusions. "This isn't about politics," Murkowski stated. "It's about ensuring that infrastructure investments deliver their intended benefits to all communities efficiently and effectively. When certain neighborhoods consistently receive less investment despite similar needs, that's not just an equity problem. It's a government efficiency problem." Crockett emphasized the human impact. These aren't just abstract formulas and technical adjustments. They determine whether children drink clean water, whether workers can reach jobs, and whether communities flood during storms. Fixing these disparities means concrete improvements in people's daily lives. What made the report particularly influential was its meticulous documentation and pragmatic approach rather than broad generalizations about inequality. It identified specific decision points where different criteria would produce more equitable outcomes without requiring massive new spending. This technical precision made it difficult to dismiss as merely symbolic or ideological. Within 3 months, elements of the report's recommendations had been incorporated into 3 separate pieces of legislation: a water infrastructure bill, a transportation reauthorization act, and a climate resilience package. More significantly, the Office of Management and Budget issued new guidance for infrastructure grant programs that incorporated several of the working group's accountability metrics. For communities that had long experienced infrastructure disparities, these changes represented meaningful progress. In Oakland, California, a neighborhood that had advocated for water system upgrades for years finally qualified for federal funding under the revised criteria. In rural Louisiana, a flood protection project that had repeatedly fallen just below funding thresholds was approved using the new prioritization formula. "These aren't abstract policy changes," explained community advocate Maria Jackson. "They translate directly to cleaner water, better transportation, and safer communities for people who have been systematically overlooked." The policy impact extended beyond the specific recommendations to influence how infrastructure planning was approached. More broadly, federal agencies began incorporating equity impact assessments into their standard processes. State transportation departments started examining their own funding formulas for similar disparities. Professional associations for engineers and urban planners developed new guidelines emphasizing community impact and participation. For Murkowski and Crockett, the working group's success enhanced their effectiveness in different but complementary ways. Murkowski strengthened her reputation as a pragmatic problem solver, willing to engage across party lines when substantive issues demanded it. Crockett established herself as an effective legislator who could translate critique into concrete policy improvements rather than just raising concerns. Their working relationship, which had begun with tension and dismissal, evolved into one of mutual respect despite continuing disagreements on many issues. When they appeared together at a Brookings Institution panel discussing the working group's impact, their interaction demonstrated the possibility of substantive collaboration without requiring artificial agreement on all matters. Senator Murkowski and I come from different states, different parties, and different generations. Crockett noted during the panel, "We still vote differently on many issues, but we found common ground in wanting government to work effectively for all communities, and that shared goal proved more important than our differences." Murkowski nodded in agreement. "The Congresswoman brings perspectives that have been underrepresented in our infrastructure planning. Incorporating those perspectives doesn't require abandoning my principles. It actually helps achieve the outcomes I've always wanted from these investments. This framing that diverse perspectives strengthen rather than weaken policy development offered an alternative to the zero-sum thinking that often dominated political discourse. It suggested that including previously marginalized viewpoints could improve outcomes for everyone, rather than simply redistributing fixed resources. Beyond the specific policy outcomes, the Murkowski-Crockett collaboration became a case study in effective communication across hierarchical differences. Leadership programs and communication consultants incorporated their exchange into trainings on how to respond effectively when dismissed or underestimated. What made Crockett's response effective wasn't just standing her ground, explained communication expert Dr. Rebecca Martinez. It was redirecting from personal credentials to substantive value. She didn't just assert that her perspective mattered. She demonstrated why it was essential to the committee's work in a way that ultimately proved persuasive. This approach, responding to dismissal by demonstrating value rather than just claiming it, offered a template applicable far beyond politics. In corporate settings, academic institutions, community organizations, and professional fields, people from underrepresented backgrounds often faced similar dynamics of having their contributions minimized based on tenure or traditional credentials. The lesson isn't about having the perfect comeback to dismissal, noted Dr. Martinez. It's about maintaining focus on the substantive contribution you're there to make rather than getting pulled into a credentials battle you didn't start. Crockett showed that the most effective response to "you don't belong at this table" is demonstrating precisely what the table has been missing. For Murkowski, the experience offered equally valuable lessons about the limitations of tenure-based authority and the importance of recognizing when initial judgments need revision. In a speech to congressional interns months after the working group's report, she reflected on this aspect candidly. Experience matters in this institution, but it can also create blind spots, she acknowledged. When you've worked on issues one way for decades, it's easy to mistake familiarity for expertise and to dismiss new approaches too quickly. Sometimes the colleagues with the most to contribute are precisely those who see the limitations in our long-standing approaches. This acknowledgement that seniority brought both wisdom and potential blindness represented an important counterbalance to the typical congressional emphasis on tenure and hierarchy. It suggested that effective governance required both experience and fresh perspective, with each strengthening rather than undermining the other. The broader impact of the Murkowski-Crockett exchange extended to how political conflict itself was understood, rather than the typical framing of conflict as something to be avoided or merely won. Their experience demonstrated how tension, when engaged constructively, could actually improve outcomes and understanding. Conflict isn't the opposite of collaboration, observed political scientist James Wilson. It's often the necessary precursor to meaningful collaboration. The tension between Murkowski's experience and Crockett's fresh perspective ultimately produced better policy than either could have developed alone. This insight that productive tension can yield better results than artificial harmony offered a valuable counterpoint to political narratives that emphasized either constant warfare or superficial agreement. It suggested the possibility of a different approach, engaging differences directly, but with a focus on shared goals rather than partisan victories. For citizens observing this evolution, perhaps the most valuable takeaway was the reminder that even in highly polarized environments, progress remains possible when participants prioritize substantive outcomes over status competitions. The initial exchange between Murkowski and Crockett could easily have devolved into an unproductive power struggle. Instead, it became a catalyst for meaningful improvement in how government served its citizens. What began with dismissal ended with demonstrable progress, noted columnist Maria Rodriguez. Not because either participant abandoned their principles or perspectives, but because both ultimately cared more about solving real problems than about winning political points. That's a model of public service worth celebrating regardless of political affiliation. If you found value in this exploration of turning dismissal into opportunity, please hit that subscribe button and notification bell. These lessons extend far beyond politics to any situation where bringing new perspectives to established systems creates tension. Share in the comments a time when you've had to demonstrate your value after being underestimated. What worked, what didn't, and what you learned from the experience. What do you think is the most important skill for turning conflict into collaboration? Is it more important to stand your ground or to find common purpose? How can we ensure that new voices are truly heard in established systems without requiring perfect credentials or decades of tenure? Leave your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more insights into effective communication across differences.